So we are going to be talking today about basically how do we prepare for coming back in the fall when there's still lots of unknowns, but we want to have some type of way of being prepared, or at least anticipating that. And also just kind of using what we have and maybe tweaking it or modifying it rather than having to kind of start from scratch and do things all over and do a lot of new things. So we've kind of frame this PBIS and MTSS, the Tier 1 framework, because really what we're doing is looking at how do we apply universal expectations, our universal framework, how do we address all kids, because every single kid has been affected by this, and so we want to make sure that we are addressing every single student when they're in our how we want to approach changing and coming back to the school year. So Sai actually called this Tier 1 under construction, because it's basically how are we doing our Tier 1 framework, but it's under construction in that we are having to change a lot of things. So a lot of things are a little bit different, a lot of things are modified about it, and so we're going to go over some of those changes. But we had a little poll we wanted to put out first, just to kind of get an idea of how you guys are feeling right now. So there are a couple questions. One is, how are you feeling about going into the 2021 school year? And you can answer as many different choices as you want. So are you feeling anxious about it? Are you feeling excited, like you just want to get back to things? Are you feeling nervous, afraid? Are you feeling apprehensive? And again, you can check as many of those as you want. And then the second question is, what are you most concerned with returning to in schools, or concerned with returning to schools in fall? So is it having to wear a mask all day, mental health for staff, or student mental health? Unknown changes. And so far we have a few of you voting, so I'll wait for a few more people to check in and vote on that. Okay, and I'll go ahead and stop the poll there, and I'll share the results with you guys. So hopefully you guys can all see this. So for the first question, how are you feeling? The red bar at the top, anxious, is how most people are feeling. We've got some people that are also nervous and apprehensive. I'm glad that afraid is the least amount, and that we do have some people that are still feeling excited. And as far as our concerns, and thank you, I mean, I feel like that's clearly you guys are educators, and I know there's a lot of psychs here, but student mental health is at the top of our list. And so that's kind of what we were thinking too, is how do we come back and make sure that even if we do have to change things, that we're taking into consideration supporting student mental health. But obviously there's still lots of unknown changes. There will be lots of health and safety expectations. So even as things are already opening up in our community, there's the impact of having to only allow a certain amount of people in a restaurant at a time, and having to wait in lines before you're able to enter buildings, and what are the protocols for sanitization and that sort of thing. So there's lots of unknowns. So that's kind of a good kind of gauge of where we're at, and I'm glad because we're going to be launching into how we want to address some of those things. So if you are familiar with PBIS, and I know that this is sent out to or available for all schools, and so you may be at a PBIS site, you may not. The basis though of any PBIS or even an MTS framework is that at the Tier 1 universal level, that you know exactly what the expectations are for your students, and that everybody is on the same page as far as what we want our kids to be doing in various places around our campus. So that's still the foundation of our PBIS framework, even when we're going into unknown situations. So we really want to make sure that we are utilizing that and that we're just adapting it to include new behavior expectations. And we've kind of separated this webinar into two different things because we don't know what next year is going to look like. Nobody really does. And so we wanted to make sure that we had expectations for virtual learning, if that's still continuing, but also physically distant classroom expectations. And we're really intentional about choosing the term physically distant classroom expectations in lieu of socially distant, even though social distancing is kind of the term that is being used a lot. It kind of sets the tone that we're not able to be social. And I don't know if you guys have seen that out even in the grocery store, but it's like people have stopped even looking at each other and interacting with each other just because they have a mask on or because we're trying not to, you know, exchange germs and all of that, but it's almost like we're losing that social interaction as well. And so really just being mindful of we need to be physically distant, but that doesn't mean that we have to lose that social aspect of our interaction. So what my guess is very likely we're going to have a hybrid for some time, that if we are able to open up classrooms and have kids come back, that there is going to be some physically distant expectations for how what those classrooms look like. But then we also will probably still have lots of kids that are engaging in virtual learning because they don't feel comfortable coming back. And that will likely be an option for some students. So we will likely have a combination. So we want to make sure that we're addressing both of those things. So with our matrix, what that allows us to do is intentionally teach behavior expectations. So in person, if we are on a campus, that's where we do our Passport Day. And Passport Day is where we're taking the students around to the different areas of campus to have them experience what the expectations are in that situation, in that live setting, to know what do we expect and what are we not expecting for your behavior. And we can still do that with our, and that's going to be very important, I think, when we come back, to have that that live action. This is what we expect as far as sanitization process, how we enter and exit the classroom to make sure that we're keeping a safe distance, how we operate playground equipment versus how do we check out books from the library instead of touching everything. How do we handle that? So we're going to need to intentionally teach those behavior expectations. And if we have virtual learners, then we'll still need to teach those expectations. And we can do that by creating video, by creating behavior lessons, by even creating videos, similar to some that you may have seen the PBIS leadership team put out, where we have little presentations, and then we've just filmed ourselves going over those presentations, and polls as well. So polls like you just experienced. So you can even say like, okay, kind of quiz time, what's a safe distance to keep from our friends? And you can even use fun acronym or different ways of teaching that instead of saying 6 feet, because that might not mean a lot depending on the age or the developmental level of your audience, but maybe even saying like a hula hoop around me, something like that. And so Tiffany was going to go ahead and share a little bit on some different examples of how we might adapt our matrix to address virtual learning expectations.
I need to hold on. I need to maximize my screen. It's so tiny. There we go. Okay, so we're so used to, in our schools, we expect some of our students coming in to understand some behavioral expectations because sometimes they've been taught it at home, while other students may have no idea of what some of our behavioral expectations are. So now more than ever, it's important to identify, teach, and reinforce those behaviors because no student has experienced these expectations before. And so we really want to make sure that we're consistent in language all throughout the campus. And one of the best ways to do that is through our behavioral matrix. So we do have 2 examples for you. The first one here is for a virtual learning setting, for if we are still in a hybrid mode or if we're still fully virtual come fall. So some examples that we've kind of put in here is you can be respectful when you're entering the class by making sure your audio's off. During group instruction, being respectful means muting yourself when not speaking or listening attentively. And then 2, some teachers are doing more of that breakout room setting. So making sure that you are respecting other people's opinions and viewpoints. So not every school is going to be respectful, responsible, and safe. You want to make sure that it's really tailored tailored to your school's positively stated behavioral expectations, but overall, you just want to make sure it's consistent with the language that you've already been using through PBIS, but making sure that you're adding in these new expectations, because like I said, some students may never have been taught these, and now more than ever, we need to reinforce them. Can we go to the next slide, Jade? And then this is going to be a behavioral matrix example for a physically distanced classroom. So like Jade said, 6 feet apart might be difficult for younger students to conceptualize. So whether that means the hula hoops, or we've seen videos of like students in China who have these hats with flapping things on the end to know that they're getting too close to the students around them. Also, we need to really teach kids how to sanitize their hands or wash their hands appropriately, because sometimes kids haven't been taught the appropriate hand washing techniques, especially now that we're going fully with CDC guidelines. So again, it's in each of the areas within your campus, making sure that you're reevaluating, is there any guidelines that we're having to reconsider or add in that may not have been discussed in previous times, and making sure that it's directly aligned to your positively stated behavioral expectations, so that it's being consistent across the campus, across classrooms, so all children are participating in the same expectations.
And so one of the things, we will definitely share this electronic copy of the PowerPoint for you guys to be able to reference some of these specific ideas, but just take a minute to look over them and notice, especially if you're not from a site that implements PBIS, that we are very careful to make sure that everything is positively stated, which means we're not saying, anything is don't do this, or stop doing this, or don't get too close to people. What we are wanting to do is making sure that we're saying what we want students to do. And that is a big part of especially managing the mental health of our kids, I think, because if we say a lot of, because I've even noticed it when I've gone into stores, and certain stores will say, thank you for staying a safe distance from others. And other places will say, do not get too close. Do not put your items on conveyor belt until told to do so. And so there's a lot about setting up an environment that makes a student feel safe, and even as staff that makes us feel safer and lowers our anxiety, that will really help some of these expectations bring a sense of consistency and a sense of security, as opposed to inducing more anxiety and more fear. And so just be thoughtful of some of those things. So even we were talking about, how do we help kids not want to touch each other, especially when they are wanting to offer comfort to somebody, right? And giving them a hug, or even like we've gone to high fives and stuff before in the past. Now maybe even that is something that we have to shift. But at the same time, we don't want to change it so much that we're sacrificing the social interaction and the compassion and the empathy that we've also been working so hard to develop in our students. And so we've talked even about, how do we teach appropriate expectations for comfort. And so on the be safe under the classroom side, you can see that second bullet says, use non-physical greetings and signs of affection, virtual high five, signal, some type of creative signal. So it could be, you know, like a little heart that I use in my classroom, or hugging yourself, or something like that, that can still help promote that feeling of community, belonging, social emotional wellness, but still honoring those physically distant expectations and guidelines. So we also talked about too, under the respectful, you can see it says verbally indicate when you need to enter someone's space, and then use appropriate phrases when someone enters your personal space. So we have to remember that this is a learning experience for everybody, and especially depending on how old your students are. I mean, if they're in high school, they're probably, hopefully a little bit quicker to understand the dynamics of the situation, and have a little bit more of an understanding of just why it's so important to keep a distance. Whereas if you are in a kindergarten or a first grade classroom, good luck. So we're gonna have to teach and model and reinforce certain phrases to help them be able to navigate those situations. So if somebody reaches across to grab something in my area, it would really help for me to know as a student, what can I say to that person? Not get away from me, or he's in my space, but I can say, oh, excuse me, you're too close right now. And so it's good to have those types of phrases kind of cued and already identified. And if we can have that as part of our matrix, which means that everybody on campus is saying the same things and using the same phrases, that makes me feel safe as a person and not like, oh, I'm doing something wrong. I'm gonna get in trouble because I forgot one of the expectations. So we want to really make it positively stated. We want to set students up and also staff up for success. It feels really uncomfortable as a teacher when you're used to hugging your kids or even like giving high fives or being even getting close to be able to have personal discussions. And now we're going to have to shift all of that. So it's good for me too, as an educator, to know how am I going to initiate interaction. How am I going to, if I need to get something where a student is by the drinking fountain and I want to get something over there, how do I initiate that as a staff member, but also how do I educate my students on how to do that? And then how do I respond if somebody's entering my space? So just having all those things laid out beforehand makes a huge difference in the sense of well-being, rather than feeling like I'm getting in trouble for doing something wrong.
I would say not just identifying some of these expectations, but almost using these matrices as like the framework or the foundation for what your classroom lessons are going to be. We're so used to focusing on the social emotional piece when it comes to school of like, how can we teach these things to our students? But even like washing hands for 20 seconds, some kids might need a full-on lesson to be able to fully understand each and every one of those expectations. So being able to use these type of identified things as what exactly am I going to be teaching to my students in the classroom?
Okay. So up next, we also are really wanting to make sure that we're being positive, right? And that we're reinforcing or acknowledging the good behaviors that we see kids doing. And if we are doing this virtually, this is like if we're doing virtual learning, then we want to make sure that we are almost doing this more so and in being extra intentional about that. So a high frequency is really important, because think about this type of virtual learning, even as an adult, is really hard to keep that level of engagement, especially if this is the only way that you're getting that type of content. It's really hard to look at screens. It's hard to gauge that social dynamic. You're not getting the same type of feedback, especially with kids when they're having to be muted or managing their own screens and their videos. It can be a lot. So we want to make sure that we're giving a high frequency of acknowledgement, and that is behaviorally specific. So rather than just saying, good job, everyone, that we are really being specific about what expectation the students are meeting, what it looks like, and then also, as much as we can, tying it back to the behavioral expectation. Like, that was really responsible of you to make sure that everybody was muted today. That was really responsible, class. And so being really behaviorally specific with that feedback. We've came up with some fun virtual feedback ideas. And so one of them that you'll see on the next slide is a spinner. And so there's a link, so on the hard copy that I send out to everybody, there's a link to a spinner that you can add your own prizes and stuff to, different rewards. And then you can spin it at the end of the day, or you can also even have that be one of the prizes, is that you can choose the student of the day to be able to do that spinner for the class. You can still have random drawings, and in fact there's lots of user-friendly things that are already created on the internet if you just want to Google like how to do a raffle, and then you can put in all of your students' names and it'll randomly generate one of those names. Random number winners, so if you identify your students by number, then you can also use number winners, and then raffles as well. We were also thinking, a lot of schools are using some type of tangible tickets to be able to hand out to kids. Now, one, if we're doing this virtually, we don't have that option. And then also, if we're looking at physically distant classrooms, it may not be good for us to have everybody touching all of these tickets. So this may be even a good idea to consider going paperless for tickets or tangible forms of reinforcement anyways. But coming up with a Google form. And what's great about Google Forms is that you can even put it on as a icon on your phone. And so whether you're virtual, doing virtual learning, or whether you are actually there in your classroom, you can still be able to quickly send feedback about your class and acknowledge them virtually for the awesome things that they're doing. And those would be some of those more big ticket items, I mean, obviously we're going to give verbal feedback all the time, but that would be like, wow, everybody that turned in their homework on time, or everybody that participated in the chat gets some type of acknowledgement, things like that. And then also Class Dojo. So I know a lot of staff are using Class Dojo already, and you can still use that virtually, and you can even screen share and show throughout your time together, kind of where people are at as far as meeting some of those expectations. So we also thought of a bunch of virtual prizes. So what are some prizes that we can do if we're having to, if we want to do something fun for our kids? And this is really important, especially for younger kids, because again, it is really hard for them to stay engaged and to manage the screen time this way. And so one of them was a chance to use the spinner, being given a homework pass, a virtual dance party, so being able to pick a song and then everybody gets to kind of show off their dance moves. Show and tell we thought could be fun for, a particular student could be able to go pick something from their house and be able to share that with everybody. One of the expectations that we had for our virtual learning is that we eat before and after our lesson, because we don't want kids just like, snacking and eating lunch while they're supposed to be engaged in a learning experience. But maybe as a prize, we can shift some of those expectations and allow there to be snack time. We also thought it could be fun, obviously teacher has to approve this, but that a student could choose their teacher's virtual background. So maybe a favorite movie or a favorite character, and that could be the background that the teacher has for the day. They could also maybe select the exit music for the class for that day. So as the class wraps up, they get to pick the song. Almost like when the students get to pick the song for morning announcements, this would just be the exit music for that class session. Also teaching the teacher a dance move, so kind of like pulling out your TikTok skills. A virtual tour, so that could either be the student doing a virtual tour, maybe of their room or their home, or also maybe even the teacher being able to do a virtual tour of their setting as well. Artwork on display would be kind of like show and tell, but with specific artwork that a student has made. Being able to tell a joke. Teacher accent is one that Tiffany really likes. So that is being able to pick, like, for example, pirates. So for a certain portion of the lesson, the teacher has to talk like a pirate. And so you can either do it the whole lesson or part of it, or maybe that's how they read the stories in a particular accent. Maybe they get to choose a story to read, or they might even be able to choose a Go Noodle exercise. So this is just kind of the short list, but hopefully it gets your wheels thinking of what are some kind of fun and creative novel ways that we can engage students with reinforcement, even if we're doing that virtually. So long-term rewards, things that people might work towards would be in a virtual awards ceremony. And so I even saw some teachers this semester already sending home things, like sending home awards. And in fact, even in a neighborhood or a house in my neighborhood had little sign in their front yard that said perfect attendance from a school. And so things like that are really cool as well. If your school can get together and even send home ways to display awards that students can earn. And that could even be participation, engage, responsibility, safety, health, things like that that you can reinforce some of those expectations, especially the new ones that you're teaching and wanting to make sure students are participating in. A pajama day. So this is great because one of our expectations for virtual learning would be that students are properly dressed, right? So that we're not just in our pajamas, but maybe again for a special prize, we can have a pajama day or even a dress up day where maybe everybody wears a favorite color, or we dress up like a TV character or a movie character. Lunch or snack time with the teacher, virtual field trip somewhere, a favorite color day, so that would be that everybody wears a certain color together, or even playing an online game with the teacher. So those are some of those things where it's almost like if you're saving up your bucks or your tickets or whatever, or even if you are just receiving those like good behavior forms, like a Google form ticket, then maybe that goes into a drawing that you can earn some of those more long-term or higher level types of rewards. So this is the example of the spinner. where you can see there's different prizes that are already on this one. Choose a homework assignment to skip, choose a book, virtual tour, class game, lunch with teacher or staff, phone call home. So you could put any of the rewards that you like on there as a teacher, even as a school psychologist. You can do this as, you know, for the students that are participating in maybe a group counseling session or something. And so you can create it by clicking on the link in the PowerPoint that I'll send out to everybody. Oops. Okay. I keep clicking on the spinner. All right. So then we'll go into the error correction. So when we're looking at kind of those main principles of your Tier 1 foundational MTSS PBIS system, first we have that we want to know what our expectations are. So that's where our matrix comes in line, or it comes in handy. And then we also want to make sure that we're teaching those expectations. So we've already gone over that. And we want to make sure that we're acknowledging appropriate behaviors. So those are the 3 things that we've covered. And so next, when we have like a Tier 1 system, we're also making sure that we're correcting inappropriate behaviors. So we wanted to take this and kind of break it down into what are the best ways to perform error correction. And so one is to the line that goes across the top, proactive and preventative. So again, we always want to make sure that if we can front load or kind of pre-correct inappropriate behaviors, that's going to be our best bet, because we're eliminating the need for the child to engage in an alternative behavior or negative behavior, and we're preventing that from the onset. So we want to make sure that any type of error correction, if we can, we want to correct that error before it even happens. So that would be if we're doing a virtual learning, that before the student even, or as the students log on, maybe we have a slide that's showing as students log on that says, remember our expectations are to be respectful by, to be responsible by, and whatever those expectations are, just as a prompt to kind of remind them. And then maybe even before going into breakout groups, we can say, now remember, as you go into your breakout groups, I want to make sure that you guys are allowing everybody to participate, and just kind of setting that up, setting them up for success before they get put into that situation. Now, the same is true if we are in a physically distanced classroom. So think about all the times that students may need to navigate the classroom. Maybe you're transitioning from one task to another, and you have a bunch of students that are moving from one area to another. We'll probably need to proactively and preventatively correct some of the errors that are likely to be seen. So make sure that you have your personal space, make sure that you've collected all of your belongings before moving, and that sort of thing. We want to make sure that the error correction is positive. So rather than, I told you to stop, or stop doing that, or how many times do I have to tell you not to, we really want to make sure that we're positive. So remember that we're going to be safe by, remember that we need to be responsible by, and making sure that those are positive. Instructive means that we're not just saying, what have I told you to do? Right? Because if the student doesn't remember, maybe they don't have good processing skills to even understand how to answer that question, or maybe they didn't get it the first time. So instead of just asking some of those rhetorical questions that are more blaming, we want to make sure that our error correction is instructive, so that instead of just saying, stop doing that, or I don't want you to be interrupting my class, what do you want the student to do instead? Instead, when you need to get my attention, you can use the chat feature, or you can, use one of the reactions by putting up your thumbs up. That lets me know that you have a question. And then restorative. So anytime we're doing error correction, we want to make sure that we are thinking about and considering the relationship aspect and component of that interaction and that correction, so that it doesn't just feel like the only time that we're interacting with the student is to tell them what they're doing wrong. We want to make sure that there's always that restorative relational component to the type of error correction. So it's kind of broken down into two components here. The what, so what does it look like? And then the other side, which is how. So how do we do that? So on the what side, first we want to make sure that we're always calm when we're providing error correction. If we are emotionally escalated, and I'm going to say this seems like common sense, but we are going to be under, and your teachers are going to be under more stress and anxiety as they're going into this next year of teaching, most likely. And so we need to really be coaching ourselves and others about how to be aware of our feelings and our triggers. So our stress levels are already going to be higher than they would typically at the beginning of a school year. So we want to make sure that we really are taking that time to be calm when we're responding to errors, that we're consistent. So if we're correcting an error for one student, we need to make sure that we're correcting that for another student as well. And making sure that even within that student that we're being consistent with how we, with what we're saying, setting those limits appropriately, and being consistent with our follow through. Brief is very important. So especially with some of our with our older students, sometimes I think we can go into lecture mode, and at least I can say this for myself. When I would do counseling with older students, it was easier for me to go into more of like a and kind of use this as like a lecture opportunity. We really want to make sure that things are brief. They actually have done a study that shows that the more words that you use to correct a behavior, the chances of that behavior being correctly replaced with the alternative behavior actually goes down a lot. So just think about, even in relationships that you've had with a significant other, or anything like that, if you feel nagged and like the person is just not stopping with getting on you about a certain behavior that wasn't to their liking, you tend to turn off your attention to what the correction is and start to then go into an emotional response state. So you're not thinking as logically, you're instead responding more emotionally. So if we really want to see a change in behavior, we need to make sure that our directions and our instructions are brief. Immediate is also really important. So if we wait 5-10 minutes, sometimes that can be too long to effectively correct a behavior. So as much as possible, we want to immediately correct those behaviors. Always making sure they're respectful. So not saying, you know, are you dumb? Is that why you can't figure this out? Or are you deaf? Is that why you can't seem to listen to what I'm saying? These aren't respectful phrases. It's not modeling respectful behavior for your other students in the class as well. So we want to make sure that we are always being an positive example of how we want others to treat, how we want our students to treat each other. So we need to do that respectfully too. And then being specific. So again, this goes along with being instructive, but specifically, what do I want you to do? Instead of saying, you know, like, stop standing up while I'm talking, it needs to be, I need you to be sitting on your bottom with your feet flat on the floor and show me that you're ready with your hands on your desk. So very specific, it takes out any room for error or misinterpreting what that expectation is when we are really specific with it. So then the how is kind of the part that we may have to be a little bit more creative with when it comes to especially virtual and also physically distanced learning. So a lot of the time we may prompt an appropriate behavior. So for example, if a student is reaching for something that I don't want them to reach for, I may block their access or guide their hand away from what they shouldn't be reaching for. Now, if my guideline as an educator is that I'm limiting physical touch and contact with my students, then how am I going to be able to prompt some of these behaviors without physically engaging or even without getting in close proximity to those students? Now, this is obviously something that we're continuing to explore when it comes to special education students that have one-on-one aids and that sort of thing. But it's just something to think about when we talk about kind of our, again, this is tier 1. So this is not necessarily individual supports or individual behavior planning, but how are we going to generally prompt our students to switch to alternative behaviors if we need to maintain physical distance, and also if we're doing this learning virtually. So if I'm having to do error correction through a computer, how am I going to prompt a student to be able to change to an alternative behavior? So just be thinking about that. It could be that you use chat rooms or private chats. It could be that you're having conversations afterwards. So that would be number 5 on this list. But the second part is that we want to make sure that we're redirecting. So instead of just saying, again, stop doing this, we're redirecting them to an alternative behavior. And that is always the biggest part of error correction is not just giving them the what not to do, but the what to do instead, and reteaching. So practice that, because you're basically developing muscle memory for your kids. And especially with a lot of these new expectations that we've gone over already, this is going to be foreign territory for teachers and also for students. So everybody is going to be benefiting from rehearsal, 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 practice, practice, practice. And as long as we're doing that in a positive way, right, celebrating the appropriate demonstration of the replacement behavior, our students are going to feel okay with that. They're not going to feel hammered and nagged, like, go back and walk again, and then they go back and do it again. It's not necessarily like that. It's go back and do it again. That is safe, responsible walking. I really appreciate that. That was how we do that on our campus. And it reinstills that sense of pride and ownership of that skill. So reteaching in that realm of being instructive and restorative is really important. Providing choices is always key in error correction, and that's kind of where we do our setting limits, our if then, first then, when then. But one of the other things I wanted to talk about was this fifth one, and that's conferencing. And I actually participated in a webinar recently that really made me think about this, because so much of what we do to support students, especially when we're considering their social emotional well-being, is shown in our face and in our body language. And so even as a CPI instructor, a lot of what we talk about in our prevention and de-escalation strategies is managing our nonverbals, right? So what is my face saying? What is my body saying? And we're going to be at a deficit with a lot of that if we are having to wear masks. So if all that you get is my eyes, can you tell if I'm mad? Can you tell if I'm smiling? Can you tell if I'm being gentle? And then what about if I have to be away from you? Does that make you feel abandoned? Does that make you feel lonely? Does that make you feel isolated? And so we're gonna have to be really intentional about managing the rest of our body, the tone of our voice, the words that we say, and really making sure that we are being affirming and creating that safe environment, because a lot of this relational component to us interacting with students is going to have a barrier to it. So instead of us just being able to be, you know, smiling and showing that good eye contact and being able to be close to a student and getting on their level to be able to connect and show that, you know, I'm on your side, we got this, we're going to do, you know, we're going to do this together. Instead, we're covered, half of our face is covered. Our bodies are going to be farther away, and we're going to be having to manage that. So just be thinking about, and I even have, you know, was thinking like maybe teachers want to have, like, just for fun, masks that have smiles on them, you know, or even holding up a popsicle stick of a smile. And that way just students have that visual signal of, my teacher is happy with me. And of course, this is something that probably be more important for younger students that just like that affirmation, and it makes them feel safe to know that their teacher likes them and is happy with them. And so it's just something to think about as we go into these new settings. So for this is kind of exploring that question a little bit more. So virtually, we want to make sure that if we're correcting behavior, we're always thinking about the function of that behavior. So whether we're in person or whether we're teaching through a screen, the function of the behavior is always going to be your best bet as far as how do we respond to it, right? So a student can still engage in attention-seeking behaviors through a computer screen, and we can still inadvertently reinforce that negative behavior by stopping our instruction and responding to them through a computer screen. So we always want to make sure that we're thinking of, why is the student engaging in these behaviors? And then making sure that we are consistently and immediately handling those situations. Some error correction can be done in breakout rooms or chats. We really want to make sure that we're reteaching that and that we're acknowledging the appropriate behaviors of others. So if a student is engaging in inappropriate behavior and you have your whole classroom, you can still talk about what are the appropriate behaviors that you're seeing from the rest of your class, and acknowledging that rather than focusing on the inappropriate behavior over here. As far as the physically distant classrooms, Again, we're going to have to shift our proximity. So a lot of the times we get close to kids when we're having those conversations. So with a shift in our proximity, how do we then again make sure that we are correcting behavior in a way that, because I know we've talked about like not wanting to yell across the classroom at a student, right? So instead we have private discussions or private conferences, or we increase proximity to our more challenging students to be able to provide that support. So now we're going to have to think a little bit more creatively and intentionally about our proximity when we're correcting behaviors. And again, how do we establish rapport following incidents? How do we convey the seriousness of the correction when our facial expressions and those nonverbals are impacted by the possibility of having to wear a mask? So, and a lot of the things too, and I think we have one, yeah, we're on our last slide. And as we kind of like, Sai is going to take this one on. So as we go into this though, just want to think that kind of as we're looking at tiers of support, a lot of what we would consider tier 2 really needs to be transitioned into a tier 1 kind of the tier 1 part of our framework. So what used to only be required for groups of students, now based on what everybody's had to experience and some of the trauma that's been created by the situation that we're in, and all of the changes and the increased anxiety that we're likely to be confronting as staff and students, what used to be okay as a tier 2 support may now need to be provided at a tier 1 level. So just be thinking about that. Sai, you ready?
Looks like I'm up.
You're up.
So I think it's really important for us to think about the social distancing while not being emotionally distant from our students. And I think that's going to be the challenge upon us as we come up in our next school year. And so I also think we need to be cognizant of our teams and our sites, because they're probably engaging in a lot of plans for new teaching strategies and new means for creating classrooms to enable students to learn. But that also means that we need to figure out new ways for us as the educating team to be able to develop those relationships, to cultivate those relationships, and to be able to help ensure that our students know that we care about them. And so I wanted to share a little bit with you some resources that you might be able to utilize or implement. I have used them as a tier 2 resource, but I think that they'd be applicable for like a classroom assignment or a classroom task. So I'm going to share those with you guys now. Let's see here. All right. So on my screen, one of the lessons that I think is important for us to cover is how do we demonstrate or teach our students or have our families become integrated in the social emotional learning for our students. And so I've kind of sent these out to parents that I work with as assignments that they can do with their student at home. But this is something that doesn't need to be a school psychologist. It can be a classroom teacher that provides the assignment, but it's a good way for us to keep connected and to help shape those coping strategies and that awareness of social emotional learning. So the first one is called Journal and Mindfulness. It's keeping calm. And what I like about this one is that it goes over the different senses of how we can come up with different strategies to help us regulate. And so it's a good talking, communicative worksheet. If you do it with a parent and a student, it gives them some ideas and ways to rationalize their thoughts and then to figure out and break down how to calm down. So you can see that it starts with vision, hearing, smell, and then thoughts. And then it also gives them an assignment to create a picture of something that might help them calm down. And then another worksheet that I like to do that I've sent out is this feelings worksheet. It's breaking down those big emotions versus small emotions. And what I think is important about this is we often have students that struggle with identifying the problem, and sometimes they struggle with figuring out how to cope with whether the problem is intense or not so intense, and then we lose kind of the ability to regulate based on the severity of the problem. So this page kind of gives them the opportunity to break down some of those big emotions and those big problems versus the ones that are smaller. It helps them kind of start conceptualizing the regulation of how they're going to attack those problems. And then with that, the parents can then also go over and provide examples of different things that might be big problems or big emotions versus those smaller ones, with also some things that they can write in for themselves based on their unique circumstances. And then some other things that might be helpful as a classroom teacher is kind of using some mindfulness techniques, some visualization techniques to help students practice regulating, but also having some visualization tactics with that. So this is kind of some scripts that I've used from a resource called Ready, Set, Relax. And it talks about different ways to calm your body. And so it gives teachers a very explicit script. And if you think about using that Calm app, it's pretty much exactly what the Calm app would do for you, except that the teacher could utilize this as an instructional practice. And then there's also some activities that are embedded with that, some discussion that can also help open up those conversations about regulation and those conversations about feelings of nervousness or anxiety or frustration. And that can also help us build that rapport with our students. Here's another one that's called Popcorn Fun. Another one that helps students who might have difficulty with impulse control or might need a movement break. I think that's also something that we need to make sure that we provide opportunities for during some distance learning, is providing the opportunities for students to move around and have those movement breaks. But this one also embeds a classroom activity and a discussion. Okay. And then another resource that I like to use is this one. It's a vision board. And I think one way that teachers could incorporate this within their class is to have students create that vision board, give them opportunities to share what their vision and what their goals are. That's a good way for us to develop some knowledge about what the student might be going through, some challenges that they might be going through, to develop some goals to help ensure that they have means for motivation. And it's a unique way for not just the teacher to understand the student, but also for families to get involved and talk with their student about things that they've done, things that they aspire to be or want to go to do. And I think it gives us a better relationship and understanding of what our students are coming to us with. Okay, so that's another one. And then the last one that I use is called Breaking Down Our Thoughts. And this is really for students who might be struggling with problem solving, might be struggling with figuring out a means to cope or adjust to whatever adversity they're going through. And it's really breaking down the dialogue with that student. You can use this as a practicing school psych or even as a teacher. It's, I think, very insightful, and it provides good meaning and rationalization training for that student. So it starts out with choosing a thought that might be giving you anxiety, and then going through, is that thought based on a feeling or a fact? Is it possible that it could come true? What's the worst that could happen? Will it still matter to me tomorrow or in the future? And what can I do to handle this situation in a positive way? And then it also gives some tactics about deep breathing and some other means for coping. So those are a couple of resources that I've enjoyed using. I think what's also important is that we think about, as our educational team, how do we show students that we care? How do we provide students who might need that extra level of attention the opportunity to have that relationship with us? And another strategy that you might think about using is called a 2 for 10. And it's just spending a couple of minutes with a student for 10 days and not having any conversation about academics, but some of the challenges that they might be going through, what motivates them, what are some places that they want to see, or what are some things that they want to do with their life. It's again providing them with the opportunity to build that relationship, And one of the things that I think is kind of funny is when we think about the functions of behavior, and attention is oftentimes one of the primary functions. If we replace that word of attention and use relationship, that's really what it is. It's seeking that relationship is the function. And if we look at it through that lens, then I think we're able to kind of absolve some of those maybe negative perceptions about that child. And it brings us down to a more empathetic and compassionate level to serve our kids. So I think that's also really important. Some other ways that you can support your classroom is come up with some unique challenges or activities or tasks. So coming up with a kindness challenge for the week, or maybe even utilizing some of the second step curriculum. I believe level 2 focuses on empathy. And in those lessons, you know, all of our educators have access to it, and they could select a couple of those lessons to support students in developing those empathy skills. And then also figuring out, how do we provide students with the opportunity to check in? How do we know what their emotional levels of regulation are? And we can do that pretty easily by just coding those and asking students, okay, find a color that represents your feelings today, whether that's red for frustrated, or green for sick, or blue for feeling happy. We can do those things pretty easily. But really, for the purposes of my slide, I really wanted to give you guys some examples of how we can utilize maybe some tier 2 supports that really could be incorporated into our tier 1 as a level of resource that helps us bridge that gap of social distancing while not being emotionally distant. Any questions?
Thank you, Sai. So I just have one more poll, kind of as we wrap everything up. Okay. Hold on, it's not that one. I'm not good at the polling. Here it is. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see that. So it says, what takeaway are you most excited about applying next year? And again, you can choose as many of these as you want to. So we covered updating the matrix of expectations, creative ways of acknowledging behavior. We also talked about ways to teach expectations, how to correct behaviors in a positive relational way, and then social emotional supports, but looking at that through a tier 1 lens, a universal lens, and then all of it. It looks like we have about 70-ish percent, 75% of people voting. So I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to share those results with you. So, oh, thank you guys. Most people said all of it. But it looks like creative ways of acknowledging behavior was a good one, and then also some of those social emotional supports. So I'm so glad that that was helpful for you, and that most of you found that all of this was really beneficial. We will be, like I said, going into or sharing all of this with you through, let me make sure that I'm sharing the right. Okay. Sorry, I can't tell what you're looking at, so just wanted to make sure it looked right. We will be going, sending all of this out to you. We have recorded this webinar as well, so that we can have anybody watch it that was able to make it today. So feel free to go ahead and pass this on to anybody. We will also make sure to attach some of the resources that Sai shared as well, and as well as the PowerPoint itself, so that you can be able to share that. And then I did have somebody ask a question just about, is there a way for us to be able to share some of this information with our staff? Like I said, you can pass this information along, but we as the PBIS team are always willing and ready to be able to come out to sites and individualize some of these presentations for your particular site. And even if you're not a PBIS school, we can kind of strip down some of that language, take out some of those specific acronyms, and just kind of break it down to what are those expectations and kind of guidelines of this framework that could be helpful. So if you are interested in that, you can always contact me or any of the PBIS leadership team to be able to set up a training that we can come out and give this to at a staff meeting or to all teachers, or even on those buyback days in the beginning of the year. Who knows what those will look like, but we can do webinars for your school if we're still on Zoom at that point. So thank you guys for your participation, and we were able to wrap it up in an hour. And you guys are feel free to ask questions in the chat, or even if you want to unmute yourselves and ask questions now, you can. But if you need to take off to something else, you are free to leave this meeting. Yes, thank you guys.
Jade, my internet or my email for some reason is not working today. I think we had like a server that got overheated. So right now my email is not working. Can I send it to you tomorrow, those resources?
Yeah, you can also put it in a Google Doc if you want to.
Oh yeah, I'll do that. It'll be quicker for you.
Thank you everybody for your positive feedback. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
Oh, you were recording. I forgot.
I was.